And now over to Thom Blischok.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, everybody. Kevin and Jim, what a great conversation. I'd like also to tell a story. I'd like to tell the story of what de-invest to reinvest means. So for the next 15 minutes, I'd like to share with you some thoughts about the future. What's most important is that when you look at the market today, you see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of storylines about what's next. This de-invest to reinvest story is about what's now. So for the next 15 minutes, I'd like to share with you some ideas about what are C-level executives telling us about post-COVID-19. I think you're going to find it quite interesting, some dichotomies that exist in this particular situation with both retailers and manufacturers. Also, we'll follow up with a little bit of growth scenarios. We're going to share with you 5 different potential curves. Our suggestion is you pick one, you pick 2, and allow yourself to think about how would you change your organization, as Jim suggested. A few thoughts about emerging shopper behaviors. Clearly some thoughts about new work lifestyles. And we have a very interesting perspective on how retail gets effective going forward. And believe me, the comments that Jim made are spectacular. And finally, what are some key strategic steps that we think that each of you should consider going forward? So let's start with a perspective, ongoing concerns from C-levels. So we interviewed for this conversation about 40 C-level executives from the retail world, small and large, CPG world, small and large distributors, wholesale distributors, and service providers. And what was interesting is that you'll see a line at the bottom of this screen here, which is unique because 50% of these C-levels said, we're concerned about survivability in the current form, interesting in the current form. That's organizational, operational. 60% plus said, you know what, we really don't have the skill sets to compete in this future state because we're not sure what the future state is. There was a huge amount of feedback on improving and simplifying organizational, operational decision-making. Just as Jim just suggested, the decisions change from the C-suite to the line executive who understands what's actually going on in this business. And finally, 74% said, we can't adapt quickly enough. But at the same time, we had 91% of these C-level executives say, my gosh, we're going to be able to compete and grow in this new normalcy. There is a disconnect here. If you're concerned about survivability, you lack skill sets, you challenge decision-making, and you don't believe you can adapt, it's tough to believe that you can compete and grow in a new normalcy. What this told us when we went deeper was that there is an opportunity for a different kind of leadership post-COVID-19. Now, some thought processes. Our recommendation, what we heard, is that that's why we're talking now about the world of what's now. Because we're unclear, and you'll see it in just a second, we're unclear of what the future actually is, in spite of the thousands and thousands of predictions, we're unclear. Cash conservation is a new core competency of both retailers and manufacturer organizations. Without question, it is our recommendation that managing cash right now, as the various curves develop, is going to be a very important play to be able to react and adapt to the market going forward. Modernization of the operating model, we'll talk about that in a second. It is clear to us that the current structure of organizations will not retain themselves going forward. And thirdly, competing in a new landscape and partner ecosystem. What is so very, very, very important about that is that in this world of this new partner landscape ecosystem, you don't have to own everything. You don't have to buy everything. As Jim talked about, micro fulfillment centers, whether you own them, you buy them, you lease them, how you change what the structure of the store looks like. But what we are very clear is, if you're going to be a winner in the future going forward, take these numbers down. Your organization has to say, how can we de-invest 30 to 35% of our infrastructure, of our legacy systems, of our processes, which are checkers upon checkers, and how do we reinvest 15 to 20% to become a much more competitive, organizationally and operationally and financially successful organization. Now, I want to spend just a few minutes on these particular slides. And this particular slide, this was help. I spent some time with one of my clients, Alvarez and Marcel, in putting this together. But we think there are 5 shapes potentially into this recovery scenario. A V shape, which everyone talks about. My gosh, we're going to get the recovery in 1 to 3 months. The impact will be minimal, but it will be structurally, it'll be a structural minimalization in that, you know, the physical SG&A world will be modified somewhat. We're going to have a lot of work on assortment and pricing and marketing. Stores will change somewhat. Inventory supply chain will change, and the magnitude of the organization will be relatively light. On the other end, we have the L-shaped curve. And that's where this virus continues. It resumes way beyond June, prolonged economic slump. The recovery is 2 to 5 years. And you say, well, Thom, how do you think 2 to 5 years? If I take you back to 1918, Spanish flu, 4.5 years to recover. Not suggesting that's the case here. 25% change in the impact in the business, which means 25% of the organizations go away. Means 25% of the operations go away. And the level of change is significant. Now, what I also want to say is that these curves in some way were already essentially being developed as a result of digital. If you were to ask us today, my guess is that an extended U shape will probably be the most likely play going forward. But that in that case there, you still have a significant amount of change organizationally, operationally, and requires a full de-invest to reinvest scenario. It would be our recommendation that organizations on this phone should plan a war game for what you think is the best scenario and the worst case scenario, and begin to think about how to restructure to win in both of those environments. Now, we asked the question about what happens with consumer changes, and try to give you some perspectives today of what we think is the most likely case. You should be using these in your thinking about how do we compete differently. Fear and skepticism doesn't go away necessarily for the population. And depending upon what happens with this extended U-shaped curve or the W-shaped curve, we see that surviving for quite a while. We also see personal safety surviving for quite a while. We're seeing the innovation around medical and health essentially being in play. Online shopping is here to stay. There is just absolutely no way that online shopping is going to change from where it is today. In fact, in working with FMI, we had predicted about $140 billion by 2025. And we might see that occur a little bit sooner than that. Entertainment, not a full recovery until maybe mid-2021. Underemployment, unemployment, that's going to continue for quite a while, depending upon the curve. But going back to Jim's perspective, there is a huge, huge change in home lifestyles, cooking, exercising, entertainment. So if you happen to be in the housewares business or home repair business, that should be quite interesting going forward. So what we see here is organizations need to have an increased focus on shoppers, channels, need to have a much better understanding of lifestyle changes and economic stability. Those are the 5 specific areas that should be part of your strategic plan. Workplace changes. I think that Jim's perspective about work from home absolutely is a place to be. We will see a fair amount of shift in safety, hours of operation. A big play is going to be, if you look at this de-invest to reinvest, will be essentially organizational changes, skills, and retraining. That, to me, is going to be the biggest challenge of all, changing the culture to a different operating culture that exists today. We'll see continued travel restriction, probably through 2021 to some degree, but a lot of movement back into the restaurant world, retail world, travel world, healthcare world will occur by sort of the end of this year. If we also then move down to what happens in retail, I think Jim's absolute perspective of restructured stores is here to stay. We're going to see a restructuring. Much of the change around center store continues. The seamless retailing is an absolute play. Redesign collaboration. I would say to you that probably the most important thing on the factor on this list is redesign collaboration, new operating models. Retailers and manufacturers will have to collaborate differently than they do today. It cannot be take all my new products and be partners from a manufacturing perspective, and retailers saying, give me all your money, let's be partners. Focus on seamless shopping experience. The biggest shift that's going to change at retail will be a demand-driven supply chain and fulfillment chain. So when we look at what's happened specifically, we will see a big shift in the way supply chains are structured. And finally, without question, innovation, innovation, and innovation. So one of the things that manufacturers are doing today is they're trimming their product lines. They're trying to innovate differently. That next kumquat, raspberry, banana, peach, blueberry drink is probably not coming to the shelf. So you're going to see a trimming down what manufacturers do from an issue of number of SKUs. You're also going to see a shifting of what occurs with regard to how stores are assorted, how essentially consumers are communicated with seamlessly, and how prices are essentially adjusted accordingly. So what should happen in the next 30 to 60 to 90 days? First and foremost, time is not going to be your friend under any circumstance. So our thoughts would be very simple. You must model ongoing cash needs for both operations and investments. Without question, even though I shared with you 5 different curves, I talked a couple of them, be very clear that without understanding exactly how these curves are going to play out, and we're very sure that those curves are not going to play out exactly that way. Understanding what your cash needs are from an operational perspective, understanding what your cash needs are from an investment perspective are absolutely critical. I think scenario planning for the best and worst case for the organization is critical. And by that I mean is that pick a curve as we think this is most likely. Pick a second curve, which we think is least likely. But it is important that the organization think through how to plan in both of those cases. And finally, I think the biggest challenge we're going to have is people, organizations thinking about how they transform to a much new streamlined operating model. Jim's words were quite prophetic, specifically in the area of how do you think about where the decisions should be made? Data, analytics, without question, are going to be absolute differentiators going forward. So as we close this particular session, if I look at the top of this, it is important to recognize the following. Your entire organization should be charged with thinking about these 3 focus points. What cash do we need to operate? What cash do we need to invest in? How do we think we're going to play out? Because I'm very clear that organizations going back to work will not be the same size as they were before. And thirdly, what is important to de-invest in and what is important to invest in? So the plan we have here is not a plan for panic and not a plan for survival. It's a plan for real and profitable growth.